Hello everybody and welcome to Early Medieval Embroidery. My name is Alexandra Makin. Today we're going to be talking about another really interesting stitch called loop stitch. Now this stitch has quite a complex story, and so what I've decided to do to make things easier is to split it up into two parts. So this is part one, and this is going to concentrate on loop stitch worked in wool threads. And then in part two, we'll look at how loop stitch was worked in pulled metal work. So as I said, in this part one, we're going to be looking at loop stitch worked in wool thread. I will talk through what my research has discovered about loop stitch, and then at the end of this session I will do a demonstration of the basic form of loop stitch. There are two versions that have been found in what's now the United Kingdom and Ireland, but I think it would be easier if I show you the more basic form, and then if I do a short of the more complicated form at a later date. So, during my PhD research, I discovered that sewing and embroidery are not as neatly compartmentalised in real life as they are in descriptive texts, such as embroidery or sewing encyclopedias. Many of these texts have their origins in the 19th century, an era of order and organisations in many sections of society, including embroidery and sewing. So, while published volumes define embroidery as decorative stitching and sewing as functional stitching, practitioners, particularly those who worked during the early medieval period, didn't separate or define stitches or sewing as neatly. I think this is quite obvious when you think about it, really. So they basically use whatever stitch they thought was right for the job, whether it would now technically be classified as embroidery or sewing. And this is one of the important aspects of loop stitch, really. So my research has focused on surviving pieces of traditional, in inverted commas, embroidery, and examples of decorative stitching used to join seams, hold hems in place and bind edges. Most of the extant examples of this latter group use a variation of loop stitch. But there are other pieces that use buttonhole stitch and possibly foot weave, also known as schlining. I think I've said that right. I apologise if I haven't. So in later videos, I will be talking about these other types of embroidery stitches and their usage during the early medieval period as well. But today we're going to focus on loop stitch. Loop stitch has survived in a number of variations in different material forms, as I mentioned in the introduction. The stitch has been found across what we now call the North Sea zone, so from Birka in Sweden in the east to Dublin in Ireland in the west, and from as far north as Orkney, which actually has a piece that's been radiocarbon dated to really before our research timeframe, with a calibrated date of between AD 250 to 616. And then as far south as Sutton Hoo in what's now East Anglia in England. The stitches find locations always place it within areas of Germanic and then later Scandinavian influence. And as such, this stitch can be used to track not only the movement of embroidery, people and technological developments in decorative stitching within this region, but also possibly whether this particular decorative form had further meaning within these particular cultures. Loop stitch was first identified by Agnes Geyer. She called it Usenstitch. When she worked on textile finds from the Swedish trading and crafting site of Birka. And from these examples, she was able to identify 6 groups, which you can see here. In total, 16 examples of embroidered loop stitch have been discovered within our time frame. All of them can be divided into the 6 technical variations first identified by Geyer, although this may be modified, there is a modified form for some of them. For example, a version from Orkney, another found at Sutton Hoo, York and Dublin, and a third from Dukenberg, Sion, Leens and Ustrum, all have very similar base to what we call Form E from Berker. What's interesting about these reworkings is that they are spread throughout the time frame, and with one of the most complex forms being from Orkney, and this is, as I mentioned, is the earliest example. So importantly, there's no obvious technical constructional progression in the development of the stitch. The embroidered form of loop stitch has been found constructed in, as I mentioned earlier, 2 different materials, wool and silver wire, with wool being used to stitch fabric together or bind hems and edge textiles. 5 of the 8 wool examples have been found on headgear. A child's hood from Orkney, a headdress from Dukenberg, Sion, and that has 2 versions of the stitch, a pillbox hat from Leeds and a hat from Ustrum. And I must apologise if my pronunciation is terrible with those names. When the 6th fragment from Sutton Hoo was analysed by textile archaeologist, that great textile archaeologist Elizabeth Crowfoot, she concluded that it could have come from either a pillow or a bag. 6 other items on which loop stitch occurs looks like attempts to decorate a seam by covering it, while the 7th from York seems to do the same for a bound edge. And the example from Dublin was found with no fabric attached to it, so we're not quite sure how that particular example was used. The archaeologist Christel Brandenburg has noted that textile items found in Frisia, that's part of the Netherlands, that used loop stitch and were dyed were superior in quality to the majority of woolen fabrics from the same sites, and therefore an indication of relatively high status. The 3 pieces of headgear cited here, which have been dated to ranges encompassing around 600 to around 900 CE, are all good examples of this. The headdress from Dukenberg, Sion was dyed black, but the embroidery thread was left its natural brown colour. The hat from Ustrum was made from white wool that had been dyed a pale red or possibly a salmon or peach colour, and the embroidery thread, which was naturally fawn coloured, was dyed a deep dull red. The Sutton Hoo textile is a good quality wool fabric and was dyed. It dates to within the same time frame as the examples from the Netherlands, being from the early 7th century. Unfortunately, there's a little bit of confusion about the actual colour of the fragment was, and the results of dye tests on samples showed that it could have had a warp thread dyed blue, and the colour may have bled onto undyed weft threads, or the warp threads were dyed one shade of blue and the weft threads were dyed a paler shade. Another sample had an undyed warp and a red dyed weft thread. The samples are not identified with their original fabrics, and although the embroidery thread is noted as using the same type of thread as the ground fabric, its colour isn't mentioned. Nevertheless, it seems clear that if the embroidery thread was a different colour to the weave, it would have stood out. What the 2 Sutton Hoo dye samples, along with those from the Netherlands, show is that there seems to have been a taste for people of some status wearing and or using good quality fabrics that were dyed, sometimes in 2 tones. They also favoured seams joined together with stitches that were decorative as well as functional. And this form of needlework would have needed more attention and taken longer to produce, with a simple functional stitch, more so than a simple functionally stitched hem or seam. Now, experiments I've carried out show that a 4cm length of the Sutton Hoo version of loop stitch took approximately 5 minutes to complete. However, that was on my first attempt, and I have become quicker since then, although I've not actually timed it. I should do that again. Even so, the finished items would have been worth more because of the use of loop stitch, because of the time taken in its construction, the use of extra thread, as well as all the other factors such as dyeing the other textiles and things like that. As well as this, it seems that there was a vogue for the embroidery to contrast with the object on which it was worked. And as a result, the complex loop stitch would have been visible to people viewing the textiles, possibly therefore emphasising that the wearer had leisure to construct such a seam or the means to afford such workmanship, which is it's a really exciting and cool idea, I think, that something so subtle could have these such wider connotations within local society. The use of wool for loop stitch must have continued throughout the period, but is only evidenced again in two later embroideries, from York in the 10th century and from Dublin again in the 10th century. The piece from York was probably the end of a sleeve, which was bound on the cuff with loop stitch. The fabric and the embroidery thread were both made from undyed white wool. The fabric is a chevron twill of medium weight and quality and is typical of middle to low range textiles from the early medieval, particularly Anglo-Saxon urban settings during the 9th to 10th centuries. This evidence indicates that by the 10th century, the role of loop stitch had evolved from being used to join seams together into one that bound edges, again in a decoratively functional form. Although I am aware that there's a lack of surviving examples, which, and this may distort the evidence a little bit, but even so, I think the argument's an interesting one. Due to the fragmentary nature of the surviving sleeve edge, which was probably discarded after the rest of the textile had been recycled, it's not possible to say whether it was originally classed as a high status piece or not. But it is possible that it was used by someone with relative status within the urban community. And as it's used locally, made from fabric that was found with other discarded textile remains and threads made from the same fibres, it was obviously a local piece. And whether this means the embroidery was worked by a native of York or someone who perhaps had Scandinavian heritage and they'd come and settled in York, it's unclear. What can be ascertained is that the embroidery must have been made by or for someone influenced by this form of Scandinavian material culture. There is also an interesting possibility that loop stitch might have been thought of to have amuletic properties, particularly by those with pagan beliefs. To develop this idea further, it's not too far-fetched to suggest that the completed loop stitch has a snake or serpent-like appearance as it winds round the object it's been stitched to, combined with the fact that the woven effect seen on the finished stitch looks a little bit like the reptile skin. This is similar to knotwork and entwined beast motifs seen on metalwork and sculpture and in illuminated manuscripts. And as I've mentioned in a previous video, the Kempston embroidery, and I'll put a link to that down below. If loop stitch was thought of in this way, It may have taken on qualities associated with the world serpent that, in Germanic mythology, encircled the earth below the sea, biting its own tail. And the serpent represented, amongst other things, infinity and power, protection and healing. And therefore, if loop stitch did represent this idea, it may have been seen as a protecting force over joins and edges of textiles. Now, although this may sound over-imaginative, we've got to remember that people from the early medieval period were adept at adding and hiding pagan and later Christian symbols of protection in sculpture and metalwork. You see it on swords and things like this, and illuminated manuscripts. So, if this is also true for loop stitch, it would add another layer of meaning placed onto it as well. It may also account for the apparent disappearance of the stitch when societies converted to Christianity and perceptions changed. Over time, the meaning behind the stitch may have been lost as it was incorporated into other forms of heritage and memory. The stitch certainly continues in places of pagan belief where people were trying to forge new identities whilst keeping hold of their Germanic and Scandinavian roots. And within early medieval England, there is no evidence as yet that loop stitch was used in areas not influenced by the Vikings after the Sutton Hoo example. It's therefore probable that in the later period, the stitch was peculiar to Scandinavian taste and possibly beliefs. Interestingly, there are no known examples of the stitch from Friesland, possibly with the exception of Oosterum, after the area's conversion to Christianity. This, along with other dress evidence, demonstrates that over time, fashions from the first wave of Germanic settlers in England adapted and changed or died out. And during the later period, the now native population and incoming Vikings had different tastes and fashions that were not necessarily passed on to the other, leading to loop stitch being found only in areas of Scandinavian influence. So the evidence gathered from loop stitch points to a connection between Germanic peoples, their places of origin, where they settled, and their trading connections. The trail of surviving examples of loop stitch points most definitely towards first a general Germanic and then Frisian and finally a Scandinavian influence. Now, although you can't be dogmatic about the origin of the stitch, the present evidence indicates that the stitch travelled along settler and trade routes within the North Sea zone. There seems to have been a loop stitch hub in Frisia, although this could merely reflect the rate of survival. Again, this is always something we've got to keep in mind. However, this is a tantalising idea because the Frisians were traders, raiders and merchants, and therefore likely to spread the stitch through finished goods and by wearing it themselves. Although Brandenburg has pointed out that because the small numbers of surviving textiles in her research, there's no definite evidence for specialised textile production systems. She did suggest that the decorative stitching, which includes loop stitch, may indicate organised workshops making things possibly for trade. And you can read about that in her article in Medieval Clothing and Textiles We Make. I will put that in the links down below, and also in her book that she's since produced, which I'll also put down below. So it would stand to reason that such objects were seen by visitors and contacts from other geographical and cultural areas, and could have been copies, if not bought as finished items. It could also be how the Angles, who settled in modern-day Suffolk in England, discovered the stitch. However, as this Germanic group originally came from lands adjacent to Frisia, they may already have known about it and have been using it. The fragment from Sutton Hoo is local production. However, the Angles discovered it. And this example of loop stitch harks back to the settlers' Germanic origins, something also seen through the type of burial that it was found in. And this piece was discovered in Mound 1 in the ship burial at Sutton Hoo. This piece of stitching could have been made by someone who originated from the continent, or by a descendant who was taught how to produce it, as parents pass on skills to their children today. The reappearance of wool examples in the 10th century indicates a resurgence of the stitch among pagan Scandinavian peoples who settled in new areas, including Dublin and York. Both these examples are the basic form of loop stitch, showing a continuation, otherwise unevidenced, of this variation of the stitch from the earlier period. And I do talk about this in more detail in a chapter I've written all about loop stitch, and this includes the metalwork as well in this book, and I will put the link to that down below as well. The fine locations of both the York and Dublin examples, discarded when the rest of the textile was probably recycled, indicates that loop stitch had become a functional everyday stitch used to give a decorative finish to items, but not necessarily as highly regarded enough to be saved and recycled. Now, Frances Pritchard has published some of her research on textiles discovered at Woodquay and Fishamble Street in Dublin, and that's the area where the embroidery was found, and her work can be found in this book, and again I'll put the link to this down below. She's still in the process of writing up the embroidery finds itself, and when she's got that published I will add that to the comments below as well. But what she's found is that although the textiles were recovered in rubbish dumps, the excavations also brought to light textile making tools, some found within buildings, but most being found among debris strewn across the site. And from this evidence, Frances was able to suggest that the production of textiles was undertaken in households, possibly in workshops located within the house, but not in necessarily specialised workshops. Well, not in specialised workshops. York, in contrast, is much published, with a number of volumes dedicated specifically to the textiles that have been excavated there. And in her analysis of the cuff from High Ousegate, and again this is being published, but it's by Penelope Wharton-Rogers, and I'll put the link to that publication in the comments as well. Penelope suggested that the surviving loose thread found at the same site matched that used to create the embroidery. And so textiles recovered from the location may have been turned into clothing and stitched on site. Within the geographical area that High Ousegate is part of, there is an abundance and concentration of evidence for the production of all crafts, suggesting that this was a combined home and craft workshop zone. So that's really interesting as well. So this version of the stitch had therefore moved down the social scale from burials of the elites at Sutton Hoo, for example, to middle ranks. And this, I'm very much aware that we're putting modern terminology onto early medieval society here. I think that's the easiest way to describe the social contrast of the early medieval Scandinavian society that we're talking about. Although this had already happened in trading centres like Frisia, as Brandenburg has shown, these people may have been using loop stitch as an attempt to mimic the elite because of its heritage within Scandinavian history, its links to the settlers' homelands, or simply because it was a stitch that was liked. I think we should never forget that last idea. Although it's difficult to ascertain, both examples, York and Dublin, were probably local work, and it may be that the indigenous population had begun to copy ideas seen on Scandinavian textiles, possibly as a form of assimilation. Overall, the evidence points to a general Germanic and then a more specific Scandinavian use of loop stitch, with Orkney and then hubs such as Frisia and then Birka, where metal versions have been discovered, and I'm going to concentrate on that in part 2. With the spread of people, ideas and knowledge through exchange, trade, resettlement, the stitch also moved and spread across the North Sea zone. So this first part shows us what information can be gathered from analysing not only the technical attributes of loop stitch worked in wool, but also their fine locations, wider societal interactions, movement of people, and therefore ideas. And all this helps us tell the wider story, as does thinking outside the box, looking at how a design might reflect attitudes and beliefs, etc. And I think that's really exciting. That's one of the things I love about researching early medieval embroidery. So I'm now going to stop here, and I'm going to show you how what I call the simple version of loop stitch that found in Sutton Hoo, York, Dublin. One of the hats from Frisia was worked, and I'll talk you through that as I go. As I said, the most complex form of loop stitch, which is found on the Orkney hood, I'm going to actually do as a separate short, and then in part 2 I will talk about loop stitch as metalwork, and what that tells us about the development of the stitch, but also of fashions and society within those particular geographical and cultural areas.
So this version of loop stitch starts with a vertical holding stitch. And then the first actual stitch starts on the right hand side, just below the holding stitch. The thread is brought to the front, passed under the holding stitch from left to right, taken over itself and to the back of the fabric on the left hand side, but below the starting stitch. The thread is then taken straight across to the right hand side, brought to the front of the fabric, taken underneath the left hand leg, under the holding stitch, underneath the top leg on the right, and over the bottom leg. The thread is then taken to the back of the fabric on the left hand side again, slightly below the original stitch. Now the thread is taken across to the right hand side, brought to the front, woven under the first leg, over the second, and then it's passed underneath the loop where it crosses over itself. Then it's passed over the uppermost leg, the most prominent leg. As you can see, I got my thread caught at that point. Underneath the second leg on the right hand side and over the third, and then it's taken to the back of the fabric again on the left hand side. And this is the version of the stitch that is repeated from now on. So the first 2 stitches were setting the working pattern. And you can see that as the stitch is worked, we're just working further down that working line, and therefore this stitch could be worked for it could go on forever really. Okay, I'm now going to speed up a little bit. Here we go. So I'm using a wool thread so that you can see the working process. Normally this stitch works up very small and narrow. Even if you start off making it quite large, the working process just draws it inwards throughout as you work the working line. It just inevitably gets smaller. It's as if the stitch wants to be small and narrow and neat. And you can see that despite the fact I'm using a thick wool, this stitch is also becoming narrower the more I work it. Right, so I'm now getting into my working rhythm, and you can see that the stitch is actually quite quick to work once you get the weaving pattern in your head and you don't have to think about it. When you think about it, that slows you down, but once you've got that pattern going, it's quite quick and actually quite easy to work. I was just thinking it's quite easy to work. It is a bit more difficult when you're working it over seams. But again, as long as you don't think about the weaving process, you get into that working rhythm. So as I mentioned earlier, this stitch could go on forever really, but when I get to the end of the section I want to work, I just cast off using a couple of casting off stitches and they're hidden out of sight. And there's the finished line.
So I hope that was interesting and enjoyable, and thank you very much for watching. Again, if you've got any comments or questions, put them down below and I will answer them as best I can. Again, and if you like this, give it a tick. In the next part 2, as I said before, I'll be focusing on the metal forms of loop stitch, and we'll be talking about those and how they link in with the surviving wool versions, and what that tells us about the bigger stories of early medieval society at that time. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!